Hi everybody. It's nice to be here with you today. I am going to go through a little bit of stuff to start. I know you had Alistair and Claire in, and so you got some kind of lessons in verification, and I think Claire is really good to talk about fake news and misinformation. What I thought I would do is just go through, I guess, some of the key things that we've learned over the last year or so, since Buzzfeed put a big priority on really paying attention to online misinformation, trying to debunk it, but also trying to expose the people who create it and spread it and understand the motives and some of the dynamics of why that's being done. And so these are kind of like 6 points that reinforce what we've seen and what we've learned. And I'll leave lots of time as well for questions. So if there's specific kind of techniques on how we go about doing this, or other specific things that I can go into, I'm really happy to do that. But I thought maybe just giving an overview to start would be a good idea. So let me share my screen here, and then I will bring up these slides. All right. So it's being shared, and let me just hide that and bring these up. There we go. All right, so as I mentioned, there's kind of 6 points here, and let me know if you can't see these slides. Hopefully they're coming up for you. So the first thing is that, and this is actually a slide that maybe Claire from First Draft showed you already, is that there's been a lot of discussion and use of the term fake news, and a lot of times I think it is misapplied, and I think a lot of times fake news is used to describe a whole wide range of types of misinformation and disinformation. And this is a great slide from Claire that lists 7 different types of misinformation and disinformation that we see online in particular. And at one end of it, you have satirical things that were meant to be funny or maybe meant to be social commentary that are often misinterpreted by people either accidentally or perhaps misused intentionally. And then at the other end of it, 100% false stuff that's designed to deceive people. And that's kind of part of the definition I use for fake news. So to me, fake news has 3 elements. 1, it's 100% false. 2, it is created consciously to deceive people. And the third is actually that it's done for an economic motive. And the reason that I put that third thing on there is that I think things done for ideological or political motives are propaganda. That's a term we've had for a long time, and I don't think we need to get rid of it just because propaganda has moved online. And so it is a complex problem, and it has a lot of different things that are feeding it, which is what I want to kind of get into. I think it's always important to understand the causes and the factors that are making stuff go around. And so to just expand on the different types for a second here, this is an example from several years ago when a big hurricane hit the East Coast of the United States. And this was a photo that's a fake photo. It has a cloud from Iowa and this image of the Statue of Liberty, and somebody photoshopped them together. And this photo was shared a lot during that hurricane, Hurricane Sandy. And this was one person, just an average guy, who shared it, and he said, nature is so powerful yet so beautiful. And this was shared from his page, just an average guy, hundreds of thousands of times. And when he shared it, he didn't know it was fake, but he shared it with genuine emotion, and other people had that same emotion. And the arrow there is pointing to the moment when he realized it was fake, and he posted a comment. And it's kind of funny because he posted this comment when it had about 100,000 shares, and it went on to have at least 500,000 more shares. So this is a guy with a genuine motivation, didn't realize it was fake, and it went incredibly viral. And you contrast that with these 2 examples here, which are 2 guys who are part of the alt-right in the United States. And basically what they did is they used the Podesta emails that WikiLeaks had released and decided that references to food were actually references to child sex trafficking. And this was a really big thing that helped feed into the whole Pizzagate conspiracy theory. So the first example is a piece of misinformation that spread because of people genuinely not knowing that it was fake and sharing it because they thought it was real and were moved by it. And this is an example of people who are consciously trying to create fake narratives out of real materials and to get that to spread. And we see all different kinds of shades of this online. And as journalists, it's really our job to kind of figure out not only what's true and what's false, but understand some of the motivations that are there. The other thing that we have found, and we've made an effort globally on this, to look at online misinformation in the different countries where we are. I think Buzzfeed now is in about 11 countries. We have news and journalists in just about all of those now. And so everyone in all these different languages, we said to them, you know, you should look for stuff that's spreading online that's not true and understand it. And so a few examples. One is we did a story about false stories and fake news in Germany, and looked at particularly stuff about Angela Merkel, and we examined them to see like where was this stuff coming from and who was spreading it and what were the themes in it. And we found that the far right was being very successful on Facebook in terms of getting false stuff to spread. You know, some cases much more than mainstream media in Germany, and mainstream media in Germany is still very powerful as well. A story from Japan. There was a guy in Japan who decided to start some fake news websites, and he decided to really focus on writing fake stories about outrageous things done in South Korea, because he was targeting people who are very nationalist in Japan who don't like South Korea. And so he played on those divisions and that bias and the prejudice there to create fake news. And he didn't end up making a lot of money, but his stuff did actually go pretty viral. Another example is a story in Italy where one of the biggest political parties there is affiliated with a web design firm that was actually owned by the party's original founder. And so they actually, that same company is running 2 news websites that you don't really know, if you go to them, are also affiliated with the political party, and those websites spread conspiracy theories and Kremlin propaganda. So, you know, we've seen a bunch of different examples. And with France and the French election, we saw a lot of far-right online trolls from the US trying to help Marine Le Pen win, and they were spreading a lot of hoaxes and rumors. And of course, the Macron leaks that happened recently had a bunch of false information in that as well. And last, final example from Myanmar, a place where we don't have a BuzzFeed edition, but where we sent one of our correspondents, and what she found is that, you know, the Muslim minority there is often being targeted with fake news, you know, with false claims. And so it really connects to that tension we saw in Germany and the tension we saw in Japan, where our biases and our prejudices are the things that fake news really go after. So fake news feeds off of political polarization, and it also feeds off of human bias and the prejudices that we have. And so when you go looking for this stuff, if you think about it in your particular country, what are the ethnic tensions, religious tensions, political tensions? If you think about those things and then you go searching for content about them, chances are that's where you'll start to find the really false stuff, because that's what spreads. Here's a little example of two guys I wrote about. So these are a couple of nice kids here in Canada, teenagers in fact, and when I discovered them last summer, they were running 3 websites that were publishing completely fake stories, and they were doing really well. Their best month, they earned over $10,000 Canadian in Google AdSense. And you know, the quote from them here basically just says that 2 teenagers running these sites realized very quickly that you just tell people what they want to hear. People will believe a lot of things online, and you play to the things they already think are true or the biases they have, and that works. And in their case, as you see from some of the examples in this image, they wrote mostly about Justin Trudeau, our prime minister, who has kind of a global profile now, and they wrote a lot of hoaxes about him with Trump, or him having to do with marijuana, because Canada is going to be legalizing marijuana in about a year's time. And that worked for them. They played on those things. The thing we see in the US, because obviously there was a lot of misinformation in the US election, is that the political polarization is really becoming more and more of a factor. So there used to maybe be people kind of in the middle who maybe they vote for a Republican this time, maybe they vote for a Democrat next time. And there are fewer and fewer of those people. Folks are really hardcore Republican or hardcore Democrat and could never consider voting for the other party, or have a very hostile attitude towards the other party. And that's what people in the United States really seized upon during the election, was to give them the stuff that really, fake news that fed into their bad perceptions of the other candidate. And so that was one of the successful things that really happened in the US. Just waiting for this slide to change. There we go. And so the result of that, and this is, I think, going to happen more and more in other countries, but this is a graphic that was done by a guy at Elon University in the United States named Jonathan Albright. And he looked at the universe of what people are now calling hyperpartisan sites. So these are sites on the right and the left that publish very partisan content, usually optimized for Facebook, that's really, in a lot of cases, about demonizing the other side or celebrating the victories of your side. And so what this chart shows is the ones in red and are the conservative clusters of websites, and the ones in blue are the Democrat clusters of websites. And what it shows is that, you know, they kind of exist in their own hyperpartisan world where they're linking to each other and never interacting with each other. And you see a lot of mainstream organizations in the middle, because those are often the sites that, you know, publish news, and then these sites kind of aggregate the news with a political slant. And what we found is that these sites, you know, they're not fake news, they're trying to report real news, but because of their biases, they often will write things that are inaccurate. And in order to get that engagement on Facebook, they will also shift towards doing some stuff that's a little more misleading. And so what we end up getting is this scenario where, you know, Donald Trump will call CNN fake news, and that comment will get propagated in this massive partisan, hyper-partisan ecosystem. And, you know, they will celebrate what Trump does. And then on the liberal side, they will demonize him and hate everything he does. And so you have these two solitudes, these two parallel universes that exist. I mentioned that we did some we've looked at partisan stuff. And so one of the things that we found when we examined some partisan sites on the left and on the right is that, you know, they're really, really good, frankly, at exploiting the Facebook newsfeed. And so fake news in general and misinformation in general tend to go after, you know, our new network society, and they tend to exploit algorithmic filtering. And this is what I mean by that. So when we analyzed 3 conservative sites and Facebook pages and 3 liberal sites and Facebook pages, we fact-checked more than 1,000 posts that they had posted, including like the memes and the videos. And then what we did was we gathered the engagement data for those posts, and we looked to see, you know, if there was a relationship between how accurate something was and how much engagement it got on Facebook. And, you know, the short answer of it is that if you look at the red bars there, you know, the red bars are posts that we fact-checked and found to be mostly false. And you can see that among the median shares, they have among the highest. And the gray bar there is stuff that was a mixture of true and false. So frankly, the more misleading or false you are, the more you get rewarded with engagement on these partisan Facebook pages. And so they are a factor in misinformation. They're not completely making stuff up, but they're often tweaking it and torquing it in ways that misrepresents the content or makes it completely false. And I think that this quote kind of sums up what we see pretty well. Whoever has the most people and activates them the most effectively determines what truth is. When you have these massive propagation networks on the right and on the left, they're able to draw people into that world and keep them there and feed them that information. And the more people that your side can bring in, the more people who are convinced of your point of view. And I think that is potentially dangerous, of course, because the scenario is that the more people are operating with bias, the less likely they are to be getting accurate information. The other thing that we have found is just the economics of fake news and misinformation. I think this is one of the reasons why we saw so much of it during the US election. I mean, there were a few factors, but the fact that suddenly there was a business model for misinformation about American politics was a real game changer. And of course, you know, we wrote about the Macedonian teens who were running pro-Trump websites that often, you know, published stuff that was not true. And that's because it was earning them money. And so, like, here's an example of one of these sites that's still up and running. It's a horrible site called truetrumpers.com. And they just make stuff up all day long. They make up a lot of anti-Muslim stuff. In this case, they made up a fake quote from Clint Eastwood saying, "All American liberals are the idiots and enemies of America," which has rather poor grammar. And here's the thing about this site is basically it really just exists for the headline. And so this is what it looked like on their Facebook page. You could see it got more than 600 shares. But when you actually clicked through, this is what you saw. You saw a web page that was almost completely covered in ads, and it just had that headline. So where's the content? There's the content. It's a headline with kind of text below it, making it seem like there's a poll, but there's actually no poll running there. It is purely there to just earn money. And so all they're doing is coming up with crazy headlines that conservatives will click on, and once they get the click, they earn the money. And you know, we did an analysis looking at sites that publish completely fake stuff, and we found that, you know, they are earning money from a lot of fairly big ad networks, and so the ability to monetize is absolutely still there for these sites, and as long as the money is there, they're still going to exist. The other thing that we encounter, and this is a genuine challenge for trying to debunk misinformation and make that, you know, something that you do as a journalist, is that, of course, when you tell people that they're wrong or something that they believe is not true, the first instinct is not to kind of say, oh, thank you for telling me that, I really appreciate it. A lot of the time, people will push back and say, well, you know, you're biased or you've got it wrong, and they're not necessarily receptive to contradictory information. Here's a kind of fun example. We found a Facebook page that said it belonged to Tiffany Trump, one of Donald Trump's daughters, but in fact, it was not a real page from her. And on the page, they had posted this image of Jesus and Donald Trump in a very warm embrace to celebrate Easter. And this started going viral, and people were like, wow, Tiffany Trump is very intense. This is an intense photo. And so we did a debunking, and we said, look, that's not her page. This is not a real thing that she posted. And so, of course, I shared our debunking, and I got a response from this woman whose Twitter bio and handle identifies her as a Trump supporter, saying, so I wonder who'd be hugging you? Oh, right, Satan. And again, this is kind of a fun example, but we encounter this all the time, where people who are probably most inclined to believe a particular piece of misinformation are, of course, also the people who are least receptive to getting your debunking. And sometimes, if they view your outlet to have a particular ideological leaning, they'll, of course, instantly ignore you because of that. And so it is a big challenge for journalists to do this. And I think we're still very early on in trying to figure out the right ways of doing this. One of the things that we're trying at Buzzfeed is we have a video producer working on my team right now, and we're trying to come up with videos that are very shareable, that, you know, are maybe 30 seconds or a minute long, that are a quick debunking. They exist as a video and can hopefully be shareable on Facebook, because I think sometimes just writing everything as an article is not a good idea. The other thing that we try to do is when they are kind of amusing things that went around and aren't necessarily harming people, we try to use the freedom we have with tone at Buzzfeed to do a kind of more fun and playful debunking, but yet to get the serious information there as well. And sometimes they're successful and you can get them to go viral. But it's also sometimes the serious debunking. So I can tell you that one of the most successful posts recently was done by one of our political reporters. When they published or they passed the new healthcare legislation in the United States, there were a lot of rumors and false claims about it. And he wrote a post about what's true and what's false about the healthcare legislation. And it's had more than 500,000 views. And it's a very straightforward post. He's an expert for us on the healthcare legislation. That's his beat. And he wrote a post, and it did extremely well. And it was very, you know, well done and well researched. And it wasn't fun and it wasn't silly, but it was information that people needed. And so I remain hopeful that we can do more of that kind of stuff. What else can we do? Well, I have a few lists here. So the first thing is understanding the problem. And that's kind of the point of what I went through here is we need to understand the dynamics of why misinformation is created and spread, who are the actors, what are the factors, what are they exploiting, whether it's technology or human bias. We need to understand these things in order to attack it. I think one of the other things that's really important and that frankly journalists ignore and get wrong a lot is we somehow think that we aren't affected by the biases that cause people to share fake stuff. And we are. We have to constantly be aware of our bias as journalists and as people, that this can affect the work that we do. And so I am always trying to, you know, think outside my own brain to a certain extent and think about what am I missing, and what about my beliefs and my perceptions and my experience might cause me to make an assumption or make me miss something. I think it's extremely important for journalists to cover big platforms like Facebook and Google and with the same amount of tenacity and importance that we apply to governments. They have a tremendous amount of influence over the information that people see and receive. And they are massive businesses, and we need to make sure that they are being accountable. They are not the most transparent organizations in the world, and I think journalists have an important job to hold them to a high standard. And in doing so, I think that we can also get them to act and to police their platforms in ways that work and also don't result in censorship, because that, of course, is a concern as well. And the other piece of it is that I think journalists for a long time did not engage with stuff that wasn't true. So we would hear about something that wasn't true, or we'd read something that wasn't true, and our reaction, understandably, our reaction was to say, okay, well then I won't publish that, which is good. But today, because the false stuff can spread so widely and so quickly, we have to engage with it, and we have to take on a role of being advocates for what's true and calling out the falsehoods. And I think this is a hugely important role for journalists today. And then the last thing, as I mentioned, we're starting to experiment with video, and I think there needs to be far more experimentation. We need to try a lot of different things to try and figure out what's actually going to work and what actually gets through to people. I don't have the answers. No one has the answers. The good news of all of this, I laid out some stuff that I know is kind of depressing, but the good news in all of this is that there are more people who are engaged on this problem and trying to think about this and try things than ever before, and that's what actually makes me kind of optimistic, even though, you know, frankly, every day I wake up and I read stuff that's not true and see stuff that's not true spreading and engage with that and work on it, but I do have a little bit of optimism as well. So that's the stuff I wanted to go through and to share with you, and hopefully that aligns with some of what you might have heard from Claire and from Alistair. Hopefully you will take up that charge to, in your work, to engage with the stuff that's not true and help people understand that, and to apply those verification skills that Alistair gave you to dig into it as well. And I would, you know, I'm Canadian, so I'm going to show a Celine Dion GIF here. It's very important. If you work at Buzzfeed, you have to use GIFs. And this is one of my favorites. So I would love to take some questions and some comments from you, and if there's any kind of tips or things that I can give that's helpful to you, I would love to be able to do that as well. Turn off my screen share, and we can take some questions. So also, if anything wasn't clear, or you want me to repeat anything, please let me know. Does anyone have a question that you wanted to start with?
Thank you, Craig. Yeah, so please, anyone, feel free to ask questions here in the Hangout, in the group chat, or in the chat on the YouTube live stream.
All right. All right, so someone has asked, is there anything that you are working on right now that you can share with us? Yeah, let me tell you about one big project that we have on the go right now. And there's a couple of, I guess, smaller things related to that. So I talked a little bit about the hyperpartisan world, and that's one of the areas that I'm really interested in. You know, I'm based in Canada, but obviously stuff that relates to the United States is of big interest to our audience. So what we've been doing, and this is also some advice that I would give to all of you. So like, how do you start tackling an area as a beat and a challenge? One of the things that I do is I collect stuff. And what I mean by that is, when I started first looking at fake news, I just had a spreadsheet where every time I encountered a site that fit the criteria of fake news, I would put the site in there. And if I had a Facebook page, I would put the Facebook page in there. So I am constantly adding and creating spreadsheets and building those out. And myself and Jane Litvinenko, who's a reporter who works with me, over several months, we have been building out a list of all of the conservative and liberal sites that we can find that cover American politics. And I can tell you, we're just in the final data cleaning and stuff like that. The list is almost 800 sites. So that's pretty wild, almost 800 sites. and most of those have associated Facebook pages. And so we started with the address of the site, and then we added in their Facebook page. And then what we did was we used a tool called Domain Tools to actually determine when the domain was registered, so the year and the month and the day. And we also, from that tool, were able to determine if they publicly list who owns that domain, what that name is, and what the company name is. And so what we're doing is we're basically going to be gathering data on all of these sites. And one of the pieces of data is their Facebook engagement. Other data being, are they based in the US or are they based elsewhere? Because I have a list of about 100 Macedonian sites, of course, that are covering American politics. And so this project that we're doing is basically, it's going to be a very visually data-driven story, probably a series of stories, where we kind of lay out what this world looks like. So how many sites have we found? And who are the big ones in terms of Facebook engagement? And for example, one of our assumptions is that in the sort of year or two before the big presidential election, our assumption is that that's when there was a huge spike in people starting new of these sites because people were interested in it and there was money to be made. So we're also going to take the date of registration of the domain names and use that to slice the data and sort of say like, okay, how many sites, were registered 2 years or more before the election, and how many sites were registered within the 2 years leading up to the election. And our expectation is that we'll be able to really show how there's been a huge acceleration of people launching these kinds of sites, and we'll be able to show who are the big players, and we'll be able to show what kind of content is getting the best and most traction. And so it's a big project. There's 2 of us on it as reporters, and we also have 2 data journalists working with us who are scraping data and gathering data and putting it all in. And one of the other data pieces that I'll mention is that we are we go in and look at the source code of the website. And within the source code, if they're using Google Analytics, which of course is the free online statistics tool to get your analytics, if they're using that, then a web page will have a unique Google Analytics code that is specific to an account. And so we use a tool, which I'll put in chat here, called analyzeid.com. And at analyzeid.com, and you can get some stuff for free there. We've been able to run all of our 700 addresses in there, extract their Google Analytics or Google AdSense codes, and then see which ones match up. And so one of the things we're also going to be able to show is like, here's a cluster of 20 sites all run by the same person. Here's a cluster of 50. Here's a small cluster of 5 run by this person or that person. So what we're trying to do is really understand who owns this world, who are the big players, what are they talking about, and what works for them. And so that's a big project that I think we're still a few weeks away from doing. But related to that, I have 2 stories I'm working on right now that are profiles of people who are running sites in this area who maybe are a little bit surprising for different reasons. Because once you have that spreadsheet and once you maintain it, this is why collecting is so powerful, you just constantly learn new things. If you're always adding to it and always building out data and putting more stuff in there, you are going to learn more than anyone else. And so this is a list that we have been building literally for months. And it's been the source of several stories for us already, and it's going to continue to be a source for us as well. So that's one thing that we're working on, and it's a pretty big project. I can't wait till it's done because it's dragging and taking forever. But when it's published, that big story will have a lot of graphics and really help people hopefully understand that these sites, there's a lot of them, and they have a lot of influence online, and they're now a big part of the American political conversation. All right, so another question here. Are you aware of any Russian pro-government run fake news websites aside from Sputnik and RT? Good question, timely question. So here's the tricky thing. And I think that the question sort of shows perhaps a little bit of knowledge on your part in the sense that like RT and Sputnik, they're very clearly, they are funded by the Russian government. There's no question about that. But when you get into that world of Russian propaganda, which obviously I imagine, given where a lot of you folks are, like you're engaging with this more than I am on a daily basis, one of the tricky things is that I think over the years, the Russians, when it comes to online stuff, have gotten a lot better. It used to in the past be a little bit easier to kind of connect sites to each other through things like analytics codes and ad source codes. They don't do that as much anymore. And so to actually definitively say this website, which has pro-Kremlin propaganda on it, is actually run, you know, by Russians is very tough. And I think this is one of the things that went a bit nuts during the US election, where there were people, and continue to be people, accusing this person and that person and this site and that site of being sources of Russian influence and Russian propaganda. And people, no one's really been able to prove definitively, like with Twitter accounts and with websites, which ones are run from Russia and which ones aren't. Now, that being said, also I think a part of your question is, it goes to the fact that there are lots of websites out there that do push a pro-Kremlin line. And it's really tough to know for sure, are they doing that because of genuine ideological alignment, or are they doing that because they've been paid to? When it comes to those teens in Macedonia, because they were pushing pro-Trump stuff and because, you know, the Kremlin was supporting Trump, there was a lot of questions that we had early on of like, well, is this actually someone giving money to a small cluster of people in Macedonia to churn this stuff out to create confusion in the US election? And at this point, I would say we're pretty satisfied that there isn't Russian, it's not a Russian directed thing. It's mostly people just after money. But again, there's always these questions. So, you know, I don't have any URLs I'm going to give you because, to be honest, I try to be really careful about this, and I think people have gone overboard. However, if you're not familiar with it, there is a site called Disinformation Review, and it's run by the EU. It's run by a team out of Brussels, and I actually met them last week when I was in Europe. And they are constantly tracking Russian propaganda, and they are constantly tracking websites that are consistently pushing it out there. And so in countries like Czech Republic or Hungary or what have you, sometimes it's a little bit easier to really pinpoint them because they do it constantly. So rather than me giving you sites, I'd point you to the Disinformation Review from the EU, run out of Brussels. I think they do good work there. All right, so yeah, here's a follow-up question on the hyperpartisan stuff. Have we contacted people to find out the reason why they are running these websites, these hyperpartisan websites? And she likes our project. Thank you very much. Smiley emoticon emoji right back at you for that. I'm glad you like the project. Yes, we have been reaching out to people. We've been reaching out to them consistently for months now. When we find there's a person or a group of people running a site or a group of sites that are interesting, we reach out and we do individual stories about them. And so I think one of the things that we're learning from that is that there is a wide range of people involved in this world. So in the early days of partisan media in the US and hyperpartisan media, it was people I would describe as true believers. So somebody who is genuinely conservative, genuinely a liberal. They want to get active. They want to, you know, put information out there, and they want to be involved. And that's where the earliest of these pages started. And these pages are now among the biggest because they were so early. But what happened is, just like there was an economic model for misinformation, there's a really strong economic model for partisan information now. And so what happened starting really about 2 years before the election is we started to see people who were, you know, maybe journalists or publishers who worked in other areas start launching these sites because they thought there was a good business opportunity there. And we also have found examples of companies that are basically internet marketing companies who said, hey, there's big audiences for this. We know how to monetize a website. Let's launch a conservative website. And of course, we've also found people internationally doing it. So there's a mixture of ideologically driven people, financially driven people. There are also folks who are hardcore partisans, like involved in politics, who are also funding these sites, whether it's nonprofit organizations or others. And so we do see this interesting landscape here, whereas 5 years ago, it was really strong partisans who were doing these sites. Now it's a mix, and there's a lot of like internet marketers and growth hackers and people just trying to capitalize on it. And that's a big piece of it. The last thing I'll just say about that is, I'll give you an example. So I haven't published this yet, but I found a guy who's a journalist who has built up a whole online profile in one area of coverage. And that's what he's known for online. But when I was looking into a fairly big conservative site, and I went through domain records and other things and AdSense codes and analytics codes, what I discovered is that this guy who is not necessarily a prominent journalist, but a known writer in this one area, was actually running this conservative site secretly. And so I called him up. I got his phone number from Domain Records, and I called him up, and I was like, hey, we're doing this big project where we're trying to identify the owners of different sites on the conservative and liberal side, and I'm just calling to check with you that we have accurate information. And I said, so our records show that you own this website and this domain. And he said, oh, no, I don't own that anymore. And I sold that domain. And so basically, he lied to me, to my face on the phone, and said that he had sold the domains and that he had nothing to do with it anymore, and he couldn't give me the contact info for the new people. And so when we hung up the phone, I sent him a detailed email that listed all of the details we had that showed very clearly he is the owner of that website. And at that point, he emailed me back and he said, okay, I will talk to you, but we have to talk off the record to start. And so, there are cases where people absolutely do not want to be identified publicly as running these sites. And what he said is that he thought it might hurt his other work for people to think that he's like a hardcore conservative. And he basically said that he doesn't agree with all the stuff that's on that site. He just runs it as a business. And so we find people like that a lot. So anybody else have a question or anything else that might be of interest?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm collecting questions. People are posting in the live chat. I will now combine two of them. One is actually the question about what actual impact do the fake news have on the audiences. There's the discussion about the impact on the election. So what are your thoughts on that? And also that you said that there's not really a way how to convince the people who truly believe those fake news. So is there any way how to convince them, what format to use or what strategy to use? What are your thoughts on that? Thanks.
Okay, cool. So the first question I think is one that people have been debating for a while. And I think one of the reasons why the question of what is the impact of fake news comes up is because frankly, I think people freaked out maybe a little bit too much after the US election. And I did some reporting showing how fake news really did go massively viral during the US election and did have a huge amount of reach in that respect. But some people took, for example, that reporting to say that, oh, this means fake news got Donald Trump elected, which is absolutely not what I was showing. But also more importantly, I don't think that's the case either. So what role can it have? I think there's a couple pieces that come to mind. So the first thing is, because a lot of completely false stories about the election, if we take the election as an example, because so many completely false stories got such strong viral traction, I think that it did get, a lot of people did get exposed to it on Facebook. And rather than necessarily somebody who, let's say, is liberal and suddenly reads that, the Pope endorsed Trump, I don't think that suddenly makes them vote for Donald Trump, and I don't think that makes them less of a liberal. But I do think for someone who is already inclined to support Trump or is a strong supporter of Trump, I think it pushes them even further into that world. So I think it often has an effect of hardening and strengthening existing beliefs, and maybe polarizing people even more. So I think it feeds into ideas that people already have, and maybe it makes them support Trump just a little bit more or what have you. The other piece is that, and this is the overall effect, I think, which is just a level of confusion. And this is a goal of propaganda a lot, which is, even if you can't necessarily convince people of your point of view, if you can get them a little bit more confused about the truth and about what sources are valuable and about what's really going on, that destabilizing and confusing elements, those are really quite powerful. So I think fake news adds to a level of confusion in society, and in particular around the election, about what is real and what isn't. And I think there are genuinely people, in part because of how much fake news spread during the election and all the debate afterwards, who are wondering, where can I actually get information I can trust? I think people are having sometimes a crisis of that. So I do think that it can have some influence on people. I do think that it adds to a lot of confusion in the marketplace, and I think it skews the information that people get. I don't believe that fake news in and of itself, somebody reading an article or two, is necessarily going to maybe change their vote. But if they were already inclined, maybe it pushes them a little bit more. So that's on the impact piece of it. I do think it clogs up our information ecosystem. On the second piece of, okay, so if it's really hard to convince people of stuff they don't want to believe, and it's hard to get debunkings to go viral, what actually works? So there's been some research in this area, and there's a couple of things that I think are really important pieces of guidance to keep in mind. The first one is to understand that in the process of debunking a lie or a piece of misinformation, you need to be really conscious of how much you are repeating that false information. So you want to repeat it as little as possible. And that's because there is a connection between repetition and belief. So in the act of trying to dispute something and knock it down, if you keep repeating the false thing, that actually may still be what stays with people. So that's really important to think about how you can make sure people understand what you're talking about, but really put the emphasis on reinforcing the truth. And then the second thing, in particular, to get past people who have, who maybe see you as biased or who are inclined to really believe that information, the thing to think about is that sometimes, or maybe even oftentimes, the best person to actually communicate that debunking, that contradicting information, is not you, the journalist, or you, the news organization, but it's up to you to go out and find sources who will be compelling for people. And what I mean by that is, let's say there's a piece of misinformation and people who are liberals or supporters of the Democratic Party are more inclined to believe it. If you get someone who those members of the Democratic Party, who those liberals will identify with, a person they see as credible as one of them, if you get that person to debunk the piece of misinformation, it is far more effective than a journalist saying that. If they identify with the source, if they see the source as credible, and that source delivers the contradictory information, you often have a much better chance of actually getting people to believe it. So thinking about how reducing the mentions of the false information, thinking about who is communicating it, and is that source aligned with the people who might be inclined to believe that misinformation. I think those are two really core things to think about. And just, I'll throw one more in, which is that sometimes I think people get a little bit frustrated when they see other people believing stuff that's completely false and is maybe a little bit absurd. And so the tendency may be like, I can't believe you believe this, or anybody who thinks that this is true is stupid. And the more that you personalize it, the more that you attack somebody with it, and the less likely they are to let go of that belief. They will feel attacked. They will feel demeaned. And so there's a saying that you debunk the idea, not the person. So find ways to make it comfortable and non-threatening for people to release this false belief. Don't attack them, don't personalize it, but really think about ways to create kind of a way for it's easy for them to let this go and not feel like they're being mocked for it. So those are 3 tips.
Okay, thanks a lot, Craig. Another question. Actually, if you could share a little bit of like backstage of your team and Buzzfeed, like how do you identify those stories? How do you kind of pick those stories? How do you package them actually into a story? And then if you do some kind of measurement or analysis of what impact your reporting has, right? So, I mean, Buzzfeed does have a huge, enormous reach, but does it actually reach the important audiences?
Right. Good. Okay. So on the first question of, so how do we actually go about this stuff? I have 2 tools that I use every single day that do have free versions. One of them is completely free. The other has a free version. So one is a tool, and you know what? I may as well just show you guys. So let me pull up both of these, and then I'll share my screen again. So the first tool that I want to show you is called BuzzSumo. This is actually a tool that's built for marketers, and it's a great way to find out what is being most shared on a given topic or from different websites. So let me start screen sharing here, and I'll show you exactly what my setup looks like. So every morning when I come in, I want to get a sense of what's been going around, what people are sharing and that kind of thing. So let's see. BuzzSumo going to come up here. And so what I've done in BuzzSumo is, again, I talked before about building lists. Well, I take those lists of fake news URLs and other URLs, and I create saved searches in BuzzSumo. So let me know if you guys aren't seeing BuzzSumo come up here, but it's here on my screen. And so basically what you're able to do is you can enter in a keyword, and you can search based on a time range, you know, week, month, 6 months, a year, and it will show you the most shared content on that particular keyword. And So like, let's do an example in here of Angela Merkel. So I put in her name and I hit search, and it's going to pull up a list of articles from different news websites, and it's going to show me what's been performing best, and by default it sorts it by Facebook. And so when there's a particular topic where there's been misinformation and I want to know like what's spreading, I set up a search, a saved search in BuzzSumo for those keywords, and I'm able on a daily basis to see what's been talked about and see if there's misleading stuff or false stuff about that particular topic. I'm just going to close CrowdTangle because I think it's slowing down BuzzSumo here. And so I set up keyword searches. So this is past year. Why don't we let's move it to past week. So in the upper left-hand corner, I've got my filter by date options, and I can see for the past week what's been most shared about Angela Merkel. And just going to close this and this because I think they slow it down too. And within this, you can sort of see what's been going around. So BuzzSumo is great for keywords. The other thing that you're able to do, so actually, just as an example here, so I believe this is Milo's site, this sort of right-wing troll that he's got the most shared story about Merkel in the past week in English, at least. So what I've got over here is I've got saved searches, and I'll just give you an example here. So the other thing that I do along with keywords is when I come across URLs of fake sites, I set up searches for those. And so here's a network of sites that publish fake information, and I just put in the URL separated by an OR search term, and I can see, so if we look at the past week, what have these guys been publishing? Looks like nothing. Past month, we got anything? Yes, so past month, we've got a bunch of stories, fake stories, and I can see what's been doing well for them. And so every morning I come in and I check, and again, because I collect sites, because I keep this data, I'm able to, over time, just refine these searches and these lists so that I can walk in the morning very easily, see what's going around. So that's BuzzSumo. That's one that has a free version that I recommend you use. The other one is CrowdTangle, which is now owned by Facebook, and because it's owned by Facebook, it is now completely free, which is great. CrowdTangle is a really great way to watch lists of Facebook pages. And so, again, if we talk about the hyperpartisan world, I have lists that I've created of conservative Facebook pages, big ones. I've got 49 in here right now. I've got a liberal list, and I can instantly see what's been performing well for them. And the other thing that is often good is you can do it organized by all posts, but you can also do it by photos, which is like, so what are the memes that are doing really well on these things? And so you can see what these conservative pages have been sharing, and you can sort of see that, because a lot of times the memes are really borderline or false. And so looking at the memes is a good thing. And the other nice thing about CrowdTangle is you can set up notifications. There's an option here in the upper left to get email or Slack notifications when posts are performing really well. And I do have a list here of Facebook pages that are run by people in Macedonia, so I can see what's been doing well for them. And this liberal page that they're running has been doing really well, which is a trend we've been seeing overall, that since Trump has been elected, a lot of the liberal hyperpartisan pages are doing even better in terms of growth than the conservative ones, because they've got, obviously they have an enemy that they can target. And you can see this page compared to the other ones doing really well. And here's a meme on a Donald Trump page run out of Macedonia, saying that this guy should be the new director of the FBI. So those are two tools that I'm checking every single day. I also, I do have a list in BuzzSumo of debunking websites as well, so I can see what debunkings have worked well for other people. And so those are two key tools that I use. I also use Google Alerts. So I have a Google Alert for the term fake news, just to kind of keep on top of that. So I encourage you to think about all those things. And I think the second question was, how do we measure effectiveness? And it's a really good question. And I think, obviously, yes, pay attention to the number of views a post has, but I also try, when I'm thinking about a post, to think about, well, what is kind of the addressable audience for it? Meaning, what is the realm of people who are interested in this topic, and how many of those people can we actually get? And so I don't always just sort of think about how do I get the most views possible. I think about like what is a reasonable range, knowing our platform, that this post might get. But let me also show you a sort of behind the scenes thing here. So we are very data driven, as you noted when you asked the question. And so we're able to see you know, some good stats on every piece. And we have a specific metric that we use called social lift, which actually calculates the percentage of traffic that went to a certain post as a result of people sharing it. So we really care about people sharing our content because we think that that's a sign of genuine, real engagement. You can get a lot of views, but maybe people aren't actually staying on the page and reading it. But if people actually come to the page and share it, and that brings other people to the page, that's really high quality traffic. So what I'm opening up here is our, oh wait, sorry, I need to reshare my screen. So I'll show you, there we go. All right, I'll show you again. Tell me if this is not coming up. You should see a page here labeled dashboard in the top. So this is a traffic report for a story I did yesterday about a new tweak Facebook is doing. And this got almost 20,000 views. It's not an insane amount, but the social lift on it is 3.6, meaning almost the majority of the content here, almost 14,000 views, have come as a result of people sharing it, whereas only 5,000 of the views came as a result of it going on our website, for example, and people clicking on it. And so in this case, I didn't expect this story to get a huge amount of views, but the fact that it was actually pretty well shared tells me that this is pretty successful. And then I can break it down here and see where the traffic has come from. Most from Google, so this did really well in search for some reason. I think it's because we were one of the only news organizations that actually wrote this story. And so we probably got a lot of search traffic that way. Facebook was second, and then email, chat, and apps third, and Twitter fourth. It did, got some traffic from LinkedIn as well. So we don't just think about overall how many views did you get. We think about kind of the views for the piece of content it was. And for me, when it comes to the debunkings, if I see it being shared, because I look at who's been sharing it, if I see it being shared by the kind of people who I think need to get this information, then that's a good sign. And that's not a numbers thing. That's me actually looking at who's been tweeting it, who's been sharing it on Facebook. So I pay attention to that, and I pay attention to the language that they use when they share it as well. And I think the last piece of the question was kind of, because we're Buzzfeed and we have a specific audience, and frankly, I think people see us as being kind of a center-left kind of company in terms of ideology. I know there's lots of conservatives who will not believe something because it comes from BuzzFeed. And so when we have instances where I see conservatives tweeting our stuff, that to me is a really big sign of success. And I'll give you an example. Recently, myself and Jane did a story about a lot of the drama and conflict that's going on among liberal hyperpartisan websites. I'll show you that here actually. And so we did that story, and it was a really tough look at the fact that there's been some concerns about ownership. There's been some lawsuits. There's been some accusations of plagiarism. So for people who think that BuzzFeed is so liberal that all we ever do is bash Trump and write stuff that make liberals look good, like we did this story here that frankly made liberals look bad. And I saw a writer for Breitbart tweet this story, for example, and he said something to the effect of, actually, you know what? I can find it here. This is a great browser plugin, by the way, from CrowdTangle. It will show you who shared a particular story. And let me see if I can find this guy. There was a guy who works for Breitbart who said, listen, I got to give BuzzFeed credit. This is actually a pretty good story about what's going on with hyperpartisan sites on the liberal side. And it looks like I can't find him here. But this is one of the other ways that I kind of evaluate effectiveness is I see who's shared it. And yes, BuzzFeed News tweeted it and all that. But I also see, this is a media reporter for the New York Times, and this is a media reporter for CNN, and this is the editor-in-chief of Mother Jones magazine. And a writer for Breitbart sharing it, and an editor for Snopes sharing it. Like we certainly got this in the zone of people who I think should have been interested in this story. So those are some of the things that I definitely think about and look at not just the hard numbers, but also the people of hey, who's been sharing this and what did they have to say? Any other questions?
Yeah, actually, our time is almost up. I think the two last questions. First one is we usually discuss that with our speakers, and we brought it up also when we were talking about ethics with Claire. Is the Trump dossier that was published by Buzzfeed? There's a lot of controversy around that. So we usually ask the speakers, like, what's your take on publishing the dossier in full without actually the editorial work?
I have no idea what the dossier is. I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, I'm kidding. So one thing I'll say is that I didn't know we had it, and I didn't know anything about it until it was published, so I don't have any inside scoop on that. For me, when I kind of looked at it and started thinking about it, I think that the call came down to kind of balancing two different really important values in journalism. And so one piece is, like, you look at the dossier, and it's been shown to the president and the president-elect. The FBI is looking at it. The intelligence community is looking at it. It's been circulating in Washington. All of a sudden, the president gets briefed on it, and the president-elect does. So one of the values we have in journalism is to, write about things that are newsworthy, write about things that are in the public interest, to also to, give accountability coverage to people who are public figures as well. And so on that side of it, like, there's no question it's newsworthy. There's no question it's of national importance. There's no question these involve public figures. So all of those things about the dossier says this is something that should be published. Now, the tension, of course, is that my understanding is we had the dossier for a few weeks, and we were working very hard to try and figure out what we can prove and not prove in it. And we weren't able to come to final determinations. And so obviously we didn't publish it at that stage. And so the tension is, of course, with the amount of information in there that's unverified, with the fact that information in there makes claims about people that may be true or may not be true. And so that, of course, that is an argument why you don't publish it. And so I think these two things are in tension. And of course, in the end, my understanding from having heard him speak about it is our editor-in-chief, Ben Smith, looked at it and he said, if CNN is going to write an article telling the American public that there is a dossier that exists that contains explosive claims about the president-elect, and that this dossier has now been deemed important and or credible enough by the intelligence community to brief the president and the president-elect, there's no way that that story can be out there and us not in the public interest show the public this information. His view is that if CNN had never written that story, we would have kept working on it and never published it. But because the American public now knows about the existence of this dossier, now knows that it has potentially explosive information, now knows that it's reached the highest levels of government, his view was that there's no way I can keep this from the public because the public needs to know. And so at the end of the day, like, his call was that the public's need to know at this point was greater than the risk of the unverified stuff. And of course there's risk with that. And of course we didn't publish it because of that risk, but his view was that it changed because of that CNN article. And so, like, that's what my bottom line on it is. I think you can make a strong argument either way. I think there's been some good, fair, reasonable, compelling criticism of having published it. I think there's also been some really good arguments for publishing it. And it's one of these judgment calls that Ben, as the top person, that's the one he decided to make. So, obviously I was surprised because I didn't know this thing existed. And I literally got off a plane and was reading all these articles about it. Last thing I'll say is what's been really interesting to me is initially, and still to this day, obviously there was some criticism, but initially there were some people who were just completely outraged. But within a few hours and within a few days, and as time went on, I feel like the opinion among some people in journalism started to shift a little bit. And certainly today, we know that there are elements of the dossier that have been confirmed by the FBI, and we know that it was walked into the FBI director's office by Senator John McCain. And so we know a lot of things since then. But I think you have to evaluate the decision in the information that was available at the moment. And it's been interesting to watch the debate. I can totally understand the reason for publishing it, and I think there's been some good arguments against it.
Thank you, Craig. And so the last question actually is imagine there's a student in Czech Republic or Slovakia, a student of journalism, really interested in this stuff, very much into fact-checking, motivated, inspired. So what would be your tips or suggestions how this student, he or she, can be kind of added value to the global community of people trying to debunk information, understand that, added value to what you are doing? So what would be those tips, how to get engaged and bring something to the table that you don't have or you have limited access to?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing that comes to mind right away for me is if you are located in a region of the world that people are not paying as much attention to, and if you speak language or languages that other people are not kind of well established in, I think those right away are the obvious ways to add value. And while it may seem like, oh, well, if I'm in this country and it's, you know, I'm off here and I'm not really part of the global network, here's the truth. And this is something that we're increasingly looking at, which is that we see misinformation jumping borders very quickly. We see it going from one language to the next very quickly. For example, far-right content that's anti-migrant. We see that start in one country and very quickly get into 3 or 4 countries within a couple of days. And so I would encourage you folks, whether you're in Eastern Europe or wherever you are, to really think about, is the stuff that I'm seeing in my country and in my language, does that have a connection also outside of the country? And so I think more than ever, we of course need to have more and more people doing this work, and we need to have it present in every country and in every language. So that adds huge value. But the second piece is, don't just think of yourself as being alone and in a silo, because there are increasingly networks that are spreading misinformation from one country and one language to the next. And I think that you can add tremendous value by understanding the stuff that you're seeing. Does it have a connection, and has it come from elsewhere? If you can help people connect the dots of, yes, I saw that story 3 days ago here in our local media or here on this website, that's tremendously valuable, because one of the things that we're really interested in is how this stuff flows globally. So if we have another person who's part of that network who can help us and talk to us, well, that's great. And maybe down the road, there's an opportunity for me to hire them on a freelance thing to work on a specific project with us. So, I mean, that's what comes to mind for me right away.
Okay, thanks so much, Craig. That's excellent ending and inspiration for our students. So that's it. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for your attention. And yeah, have a nice evening.
All right, thanks, everyone. Good luck. Bye-bye.